Thanks to Paul Murphy for another great show there. You're listening to the Lioness on Riviera FM on Monday the 9th of June 2014, and it's just gone 3 o'clock. I hope you like that little musical mix I made for you to start the show. That's a fabulous rendition of Can't Touch This, and that was by the Posh Bird. And I thoroughly recommend you look her up. She's definitely going to be a star. All her music is donated as a fundraiser for the Biscuit Fund, and you can find out more about that by visiting theposhbird.co.uk. Right then, I have Nick and Max here in the studio with me as usual to join the conversation and help with all your comments and messages. You can email the show on studio@Riviera FM, or comment on the Facebook pages The Lioness Raw or Riviera FM, and we'll attempt to include you live on the show. Today we're talking about consent. What is consent? What is it? How does it come about? Are we governed by consent? Are we policed by consent? And who precisely is it that consents? I'm hoping to have a guest come in soon. She's late, if she's coming at all. She has told me she's coming, so we're waiting to hear from our guest, and if she does turn up I will introduce you. So we're jumping past the section where we were going to introduce her and talk straight away. And we're going to go straight in with Max, who is Mr. Dictionary Corner here, who's going to just tell us what consent actually is.
Well, yeah, good afternoon, Lioness. This is from the Oxford Dictionary. Origin is Middle English from the Old French consente, which is a noun, and consentir. My French is terrible, as you know. From Latin consentire, from con, which means together, and sentire, which means feel. So sort of feel together, consent.
Feel together.
Yeah, a noun. As a noun, it's permission for something to happen or agreement to do something. As in something like no change may be made without the consent of all partners. And as a verb, it's to give permission for something to happen. An example of that is he consented to a search by a detective, for example. Consent of the governed is a phrase that comes from the United States Declaration of Independence, and it's synonymous with a political theory wherein a government's legitimacy and moral right to use state power is only justified and legal when derived from the people or society over which that political power is exercised. This theory of consent is historically contrasted to the divine right of kings and has often been invoked against the legitimacy of colonialism. Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, quote, "The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government," unquote.
Well, there we are. So the will of the people. And consent is coming together.
That would feeling together, actually. Feeling together.
Well, I've got something similar to that just to bring us into the show. Not quite your Latin there, but come together. It was close as I could get it. That was the Beatles here. You're listening to Lioness here on Riviera FM. I'm delighted to say my guest has come now. We can talk to her. This is my studio guest today. She qualified in 1987. I've taken information from their website. I hope it's right. And was a sole practitioner in Exeter before becoming a founder partner of the legal practice Bay Advocates. She's a higher courts advocate, which entitles her to conduct matters in the Crown Court and above, a position usually the preserve of barristers. She has developed a reputation for going the extra mile for clients, achieving impressive results in the process. In her spare time, she has a keen interest in all sports, especially cricket, and participates in rowing. This is the weather for it, certainly. And it says here she was training for her first marathon. I don't know if that's happened yet or not, but how exciting. And her biggest interest is in travelling of all types and to all places. So, from Bay Advocates, I'd like to welcome my first guest to the show. This is Anne Bell-Chambers, LLB.
Thank you.
Welcome, Anne. Right, so thank you for coming on such short notice, because we only spoke on Friday lunchtime, I think, so I do appreciate you coming in here, thank you. So yes, you missed our little introduction here, but we're talking today on the subject of consent. What is consent and what isn't consent? Are you happy if I ask for your sort of personal opinion on things? Are you happy to just dip in as Anne rather than Anne the lawyer in some cases?
I'm Anne first, lawyer second.
Good,
so.
good. We like that. Thank you very much. I like that. That's comfortable. Comforting too. So on the subject of consent, are we, in anyone's opinion here, are we governed by consent in the UK?
Well, if you started with democracy, I suppose possibly not, given that so people turn out to vote these days. So there's an issue there as to whether or not more people ought to contribute to the process.
But by ought to contribute to the process, do you mean more people ought to vote or more people ought to stand to be voted for?
Both.
Both. Yeah, I think there's been a lot. We've had previous shows here, and there's been discussion about particularly it appears to be virtually a two-party system. You have the others dip in there, but basically it's a two-party system. And we discussed the Bilderberg issue, where it appears to be an auditioning process by those who are going to be chosen to go to Bilderberg, and then those are the ones that we get to tick the boxes for. So with a two-party situation, if we really don't have informed consent, as in what are we voting for, who are we voting for, and particularly who is controlling behind the scenes, how can it be consent? How can it be seen as consent if we don't know what we're consenting to?
Well, I don't think it can be. We've got the issue at the moment that we're facing as criminal lawyers, and I think I'm going to disappoint those that I work with, because I can't remember the name, but he's a Conservative QC who's come out and said the changes that are being suggested by the government, which will mean the closure of most small practices like we currently run,
Really?
are being driven by the civil service. Well, we don't have any vote as far as they're concerned. They progress, they have their own agenda. They've decided they only want one sort of lawyer, not barristers and solicitors, and it's a Conservative Party QC who's come out and said it's not anybody's policy, it's actually driven by the civil service.
Well, yes. I mean, do we remember the show Yes Minister back in the
Absolutely,
day?
yes.
I think we all know. And again, that takes us back to the democracy argument. And personally, this is just me personally, I think democracy is a horrendous idea. But even if it was democracy, it's undermined by the fact that the decision-making really is done by unelected people who have jobs for life and aren't party political. So, and again, there's the argument that it's...
pension too.
A very nice pension. And there's also the argument that it's an oligarchy, because above that you've got the Windsors who are making the decisions for the other ones down under those too. So where democracy quite comes in, I don't know. And where consent can come in, I personally cannot fathom.
Can there be consent in a constitutional monarchy?
Without a constitution that's acknowledged.
We have a constitution.
We do, but it doesn't appear to be acknowledged in court.
There's not the US system of a constitution written in stone.
It's in one document, that's the difference, I think.
Yes.
Or we have Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, and what's the other thing?
Declaration of Rights.
Declaration's right. Oh, I was right. Yeah. I didn't know that about trying to close down small practices, though. That's shocking.
It's come out of supposedly an austerity measure, a government policy to
legal aid, isn't it?
Legal aid to save 220 million,
Yes.
taking no account of figures. The government, if you notice, will only say that it's the most expensive legal aid system in the world every time they're asked.
Yes.
And they won't listen and they won't discuss, and you have senior barristers, senior lawyers all trying to talk to Mr. Grayling, who won't talk to them.
Of course.
Maybe because he's only being fed certain information by the civil servants and he doesn't really know or doesn't choose to know.
Is this to come into line with the European court ruling sort of thing? I mean, and we've always had innocent until proven guilty.
Yes.
And the European method is guilty until you prove yourself innocent, as far as I can work out.
They have a whole different approach.
Yeah.
I mean, theirs is very judge-led.
That's the Napoleonic laws.
Napoleonic
Yes,
law, yeah.
And so you have the judges who start off as judges, trained to be judges, unlike the system, and they are the ones that lead the investigation. So it's a different system. It's not our system of two sides arguing to, as you say, start from the point of innocence.
Yeah.
They carry out the investigation. There's, I think, always at least 3 judges. Further up the scale, the more of them.
So if you actually come before a judge, you are guilty. You know, you're taken to be guilty because the mere fact you've actually arrived there.
It's a bit like the use of a grand jury.
Absolutely, certainly.
I certainly don't know enough about the sort of continental system to say, but I do know that having appeared, then obviously there's an investigation that they're leading.
Absolutely. It's worrying. It is worrying that our rights appear to be eroded more and more and more, and our access to justice becomes more and more difficult with the removal of legal aid and more legislation to prosecute us. It does seem that we are very much targeted.
There's certainly massive amounts of legislation being introduced all the time.
Yes, we'll discuss that later. You've got quite a bit about. Thank you very much. I'm going to play just a little bit of music. This is Steve Miller and Abracadabra.
Riviera FM. Riviera FM. Riviera FM, bringing social game to Torbay.
Good afternoon, and we have here a definition of 4 main types of consent. The first is implied consent. It's a controversial form of consent which is not expressly granted by a person, but rather inferred from a person's actions and the facts and circumstances of a particular situation, or in some cases by a person's silence or inaction. Secondly, we have express consent. Is clearly and unmistakably stated rather than implied. It may be given in writing, by speech, or non-verbally, e.g. by clear gesture such as a nod. Non-written express consent cannot, not evidenced by witnesses, or an audio or video recording may be disputed if a party denies that it was given. And number 3 would be informed consent. In medicine, is consent given by a person who has clear appreciation and understanding of the facts, implications, and future consequences of an action. The term is also used in other contexts, permission granted in full knowledge of the possible consequences, typically that which is given by a patient to a doctor for treatment with knowledge of the possible risks and benefits. And then fourthly, there's unanimous consent or general consent by a group of several parties, for example an association, is consent given by all parties. Consent as understood in law may differ from the ordinary English language meaning. For example, a person under the age of consent may genuinely consent to a sexual act as understood in English, but that consent is not recognised as valid in law. The theory of tacit consent of the governed holds that if the people live in a country that is not undergoing a rebellion, they have consented to the rule of that country's government. Yet, when people do rebel, as has been seen many times in recent years on our streets, the police violently attack civilians, and if or when people like Boris Johnson and Theresa May get their way, they'll be attacking them with water cannon and rubber bullets. My guests, after the news, will give us their first-hand experience of what it's like to attempt to peacefully rebel. And on Friday, it was revealed that the government shuts down 2 e-petitions every day in a bid to stifle dissent.
That's government's own words there. In a bid to stifle dissent, they shut down 2 e-petitions a day. Petitions to the government to not do something to them or about them or for them, and not stifle their voice, I suppose. So yeah, 4 types of consent we're talking about then: implied consent, express consent, informed consent, and unanimous consent. And that idea that the government holds that if people live in a country that's not undergoing a rebellion, they have consented to the rule of that government. How can that work then? How can that be consent?
Well, when they introduce acts or statutes through Parliament, what they require going through Parliament to give it this assent or consent, as they call it, is for assent from the Queen, followed by consent from the House of Lords, and then consent from the commoners. Now, if the commoners were actually representative of the people of the island, then we may have a voice in this. But as it happens, how many of the people in the Commons are millionaires? Mm. They don't kind of fall into the normal commoner as you would accept it.
A high percentage of public school boys and old Etonians as well, I believe.
Oh.
Bullingdon boys, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I've got hand signals going on here, really do confuse me. Yeah, and also the informed consent here, this that people coming into this country have consented to the rule of the government. That's correct. So if someone coming from another company was to emigrate to England,
company
Britain,
yes,
I know, Freudian slip, I do apologise.
But appropriate.
then they do agree, don't they? They do sign a document, and I think they actually swear a declaration, don't they, to say that they will uphold the laws and they will be a good citizen, etc. here. So yes, if you are coming to a jurisdiction where you need to be aware of the laws and the rules and regulations, then you're agreeing to follow them. But if you're born here...
You don't swear oath.
No, and if you don't consent as an individual, who does? Because we were talking about, you were just saying there about the legislation's given royal assent, and
Yes.
it first goes through the Commons and then it goes through the Lords. That is consent of the monarch that legislation shall
Consent of the governors rather than the
exist.
Yes.
governed.
Yes, yeah. But also there's this I've lost my thread again. Retrack.
Well, I suppose you've got the doors symbolically being closed on the monarch by a black rod knocks to symbolise
Yes.
that the Commons are the ones in control.
Yes.
But then you've got the issue of who are the people actually behind that door, purporting to represent the ordinary people.
Yeah.
If you're looking at extremes, I imagine that with the European votes, UKIP were the winners, if whatever that definition might be,
Yeah.
and yet they have nobody. Not that I support their views, but they have nobody in the House of Commons,
Well-
which seems to beg the question: how does that work?
Well, none of us do. Nobody voted for this shower, did they? They got in by default, didn't they?
Well, they
'Cause
made
they-
themselves a unit in order to carry on.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
And Lib Dems really upset their supporters by doing that, and I can understand why not. That I was a supporter of anyone. I don't believe I need to be governed. If I can say, can I, as an adult, a living adult, compos mentis, completely not here to harm anybody, go anywhere and say to somebody, hello, do you know what? I do not consent to be governed.
Well, I've tried that. It didn't work very well.
No, you get locked up.
Well,
I did 3 days for it.
I was forcibly searched on Torquay Harbourside.
Yes.
And the one thing that did come out of this, regardless of the fact that I stated that I was not about to consent to anything that they were trying to inflict upon me.
Well, the background story was he was walking along the street and somebody behind him, because of where the smoke was coming from, was clearly from behind him, had been smoking an illicit substance, of which
Indeed.
a police
They
male came up to Nick, and insisted that he was going to
He
be
wanted to
stopped.
search me,
He
yeah.
said, is it you? And Nick said, of course not, it's not me, and he wasn't having any of it. Yet we understand the fact that if there is, quote, reasonable suspicion, people have to do their job.
yes,
But what's the interesting thing is the thing you've got there.
there's a note on the back of the form that they
That's
issued
sure.
me with after the search, and it says quite clearly, juveniles, people suffering from a mental health issue, and others who appear not to be capable of giving an informed consent should not be subject to a voluntary search. So that being the case,
Who should be subject to it?
is it then an imperative that they have consent from whoever they are about to search?
it's a very odd wording, because if you were completely off your head on a substance, you probably wouldn't understand the term of consent and wouldn't be able to be searched the very person that they would like to search.
Absolutely, but I mean, I could put it to you that I'm incapable of giving an informed consent because I just do not agree with what they want to do.
Or do not understand precisely why they want to do it.
I wouldn't understand or stand under anything that they wanted me to do. The fact of the matter is that it would appear from this, although they don't put it in plain black and white and in plain language, but it would appear that without consent, without informed consent, they're not entitled to do a search, because it isn't a voluntary search, is it?
It's one of those lovely areas that need testing, probably.
Well, I tested it and ended up face down on the pavement.
Well, unfortunately, that's what happens first before you get anywhere near a court where the issues and terminology can be examined.
Yeah,
Yes,
no,
if only it worked that way. We do like these lovely theories. Yes, thank you very much. So, yes, if you just joined us here, you're listening to the Lioness on Riviera FM. Hello, it's a lovely day. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you for having us with you. Today we're talking about consent and asking who consents for me if I don't. I've Nick and Max with me as usual, and Anne Bell Chambers, who is a criminal law specialist and founding partner of Bay Advocate. She's here with me in the studio as well. So ways we do consent. Well, we know with informed consent, we do consent to, in marriage, for example. It takes two. We say, I do consent. And it may seem a bit of an odd thing, but we discussed this earlier, and divorce is also mutually consensual, or it is consensual, not necessarily mutually. But consent is involved because one person no longer consents to be married to the other, and you can't have a marriage with just one person.
Without consent. Yeah.
So do we sort of agree that consent can be
Necessary.
bilateral and unilateral, shall we say?
Enforced on you by choice of somebody else.
Yes.
Or your own choice, as in the marriage or the...
Yes.
Yeah, well, that is consensual if
Yes.
your own
Yes.
choice, isn't it? Most medical treatment, I say most medical treatment because we've heard about these women who have had caesarean sections performed upon them recently and their children stolen away before they were even born. Certain amounts of vaccinations, etc. Now we're having schools and places that say your children cannot come unless they are mandatorily
Most surgeries,
vaccinated.
though, and that sort of thing.
Well,
are,
I think it would be if you were awake.
yeah.
You know,
If medical
obviously.
staff are being forced to have vaccinations to keep their jobs now.
My daughter is
Yes.
to work in the hospital
That's
here.
right.
Not happy with that at all, but there we are. So there are ways of consent, and again, you were talking about that document you read earlier about informed consent.
Yes.
In law, and you may know more about this than I do, but in law it appears to be that informed consent, in the legal dictionaries that we have looked at, only talks about medical treatment. Informed consent. It doesn't appear to apply in legal dictionaries in any other sphere whatsoever. That we can find, not saying it doesn't.
That's probably right off the top of my head, because nobody's dared to define it elsewhere, whereas obviously in a medical scenario they can at least try. I mean, it's very difficult. There have been instances of people suggesting that babies should be injected in a certain way, somebody writing a report and saying, no, that's all wrong, that's not good for them.
Yeah,
and then somebody coming back and saying, no, actually the first version was right. So even there you have what is the information and who's giving it.
I think that depends on who's paying for the reports to come out, quite honestly. And also there's legislation here now, I can't think of the name of it, there is the something act, you get money, there is a legislation that says here is money for compensation for vaccine damage act.
Yes,
I'm paraphrasing here. So it's acknowledged that vaccines do damage because there is legislation here set up primarily for compensation for it.
Presumably, if you can prove the connection.
Yeah, there was a girl about 2 days ago, wasn't there?
Sure.
Got a good number of £1 million for it because it destroyed her. Just destroyed her, this young girl.
Yes,
so,
indeed.
yeah.
It's very difficult to prove, though, because you're up against big multinational drugs companies.
Big money.
So again, how can this be law if it's forced upon us by corporations, for example? How can we this always comes into all the discussions and the different topics that we have. We always come down to this little nitty-gritty. What is law if it isn't force?
I'm just looking at, for my own personal interest, international law, and of course with international law it's people voluntarily subscribe to it because there isn't really a means of enforcement. There's the ultimate means of enforcement in which you go to war, but
NATO, yeah.
For example, in the Russian situation, we don't want to threaten to bomb Mr. Putin because he's big and he's got lots of weapons.
It really would be rather foolish, wouldn't it, and rather arrogant. But then we tag along with America.
Yes,
and they're bigger than us.
He wanders into Crimea and says, they've had a referendum, they've chosen to come with us. We don't know the true situation. But of course, where's the enforcement? The UN can shout all it's like, but without the power to do something unpleasant as a flip side, which is why you have all these weird and wonderful sanctions against oligarchs rather than anybody saying, Mr. Putin, well, I think they have said you can't come and play with us at G8, it's now G7. But,
I bet I missed that. You'll probably get it on the internet. But then we even that, what we hear in the UK, we hear generally through the mainstream media. BBC is heavily influenced, shall we say, or appears to be, with government propaganda. It puts out the government story, it puts out the side that we're supposed to hear about. I mean, look, before these recent elections, everyone was talking about UKIP. Yes, they were saying they were bad, they were awful, they were dreadful, they were this, they were racist, they were stark raping mad in some cases, most of them that I read about. But the point is that it was getting it into the public consciousness, UKIP,
Bringing
and of course people went
UKIP
out
into the one-party system.
That old
No
saying,
such thing as bad publicity.
that's exactly that old saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity, and it's worked.
Because I believe the Greens said, well, we've got a member of Parliament, we had as many people standing,
Who
we
mentioned us?
Yeah.
Exactly. You wonder whether people buy this media coverage, or whether it's by design. I don't know. Anyway, but we're talking about consent, and again, ways we do consent. We consent in employment. You go into a job, you do the job, you know what your job description is, and if you breach that job description, you agree that you can be sacked for it, for example.
Well, that's contract, isn't it? That's agreeing to provide
well, that's
a
the next
certain
thing
performance.
I've got here, business contracts. All business contracts are consensual, aren't they?
Well, consent is a
Must
form
be.
of playing by the rules, I suppose, but then you come down to whose rules.
Exactly, you do. Well, all laws are rules,
Absolutely.
but not all rules are laws.
No.
That came from my very first law degree.
Well done.
My very first tutorial. I also remembered, before you say you don't consent, establish that consent is required. That was quite a difficult one for me to get into my head, but now I bore people silly always saying that, because I think it's correct. So perhaps today we can establish if consent is required. So there are ways we don't consent. Well, force and the violent use of force. Fear or threat. Coercion. Coercion is what's that called? It's a something. There's a particular term for coercion. I think Max has got that, haven't you?
Intimidation of a victim to compel the individual to do some act against his or her will by the use of psychological pressure, physical force, or threats. The practice of forcing another party to act in an involuntary manner by use of intimidation or threats, or some other form of pressure or force. These actions can include, but are not limited to, especially, as we've got a lawyer in the room, we like the word include, extortion, blackmail, torture, and threats to induce favours. In law, coercion is codified as a duress crime.
That's the word I was looking for, duress crime. Thank you very much.
Riviera FM. Riviera FM, bringing social game to Torbay.
Good morning, Judge, by 10cc. We've been looking for some appropriate music here, there, and we hope you like that. Now, this is Lioness here. I'm with Nick and Anne, and Nick and Anne. There, you've gone up and... sorry, Max, you've gone down one. We're talking here about consent on Riviera FM. Now, Home Office publication number 25060, dated 10th of December 2012, entitled Policing by Consent, says this. It should be noted that it refers, policing by consent being the it refers to the power of the police coming from the common consent of the public, as opposed to the power of the state. It does not mean the consent of an individual. No individual can choose to withdraw his or her consent from the police or from a law. Now, this is where I attempt to speak Latin. Ignorantia juris non excusat. Ignorance of the law does not excuse. Now, we have got here a document that shows how many legislations were passed this year. In this year, to date, 2014, 1,758 pieces of legislation have been passed as of one day last week, when I took a print screen of the government's legislation list page. That's an average of 293 pieces of legislation per month, or 9.6 per day. Now, last year, that was an average of 339 pieces of legislation per month, or 11 pieces of legislation per day. And obviously, we're having the 9.6 per day on top of that. There's not changes. We're just getting more and more and more of them. So, ignorance of the law does not excuse, or ignorance of the law excuses no one. That's a legal principle holding that a person who is unaware of a law may not escape liability for violating that law merely because he or she was unaware of its consent. Now, there is an acronym that begins with B and ends with S, and I'm not going to say it because it must really be absolute BS. How can anyone, how do we know, how do you're a criminal law specialist here, sitting here, how many laws are we breaking right this moment, somewhere in the world, somewhere that applies to us, whether it's European law or us? How do we know?
I'm sure there's bound to be some. Inevitably, probably one about the heat of the room we're
I know,
sitting
it's dreadful, isn't it? It is awful. I do apologise. Actually, I can make that slightly better by turning the CD rack off. Yeah. But ignorance of the law is no... Actually, there is no law for maximum heat in an office. It's minimum.
Oh, right. Oh, well, so we can sit in a
It's okay
sauna,
to
melt.
yeah, but we can't freeze to death.
Yeah.
Well, that's comforting.
No charge for that little bit of legal advice. Yes. So if it's consent, then it is consent if a fully competent and sane adult could ever be fully informed. Is it possible for anyone ever, to be fully informed of all the legislation that has existed to date, plus the 9.6 that they're bringing every day?
You used the word. You used a word saying that ignorance and unaware, and ignorance to me infers awareness.
It means ignorance.
Exactly, you're ignoring.
It's an active
which
thing.
Despite the
It's
fact
not a
that you
passive
know.
thing, it's an
Which
active
means
thing.
that you're actually aware of it. So, being unaware of a bit of legislation is not ignorance, to me.
And it's also a moot point, I suppose, is how can anybody be aware of that amount of legislation, even people like me who are supposed to be?
But could you possibly hold in your head as a human being every piece and every section, subsection and subsection of every piece of legiation that exists? Could you know?
Of course not, because you're a human being, you've got other things in your head as well.
Your dinner conversation would be really something else.
Nor should you actually need to. I mean, it would take up your whole life to even get close to understanding just a small percentage of it. So we're not here for that. We didn't arrive in this world to spend all our time looking at regulations that somebody else has written that we're supposed to live by.
Yeah, this was my definition that I made up of government about 2 or 3 years ago. That government exists to punish people for not following rules they never agreed to follow in the first place.
Yeah, that's not too far off the mark, I wouldn't have thought.
And legal definitions also change. Now, legal definitions don't necessarily follow common usage, do they? And I know you were talking, Nick was talking the other day about Bill Clinton when he was being asked about the Monica Lewinsky
yes, that
affair,
was
and hints on which definition of the word "is" you are using. And it does. It really does. And I think that's when you can be canny, and I think it's when you can be particularly
Most of the legislation
deceitful.
and acts have got definitions written into them of most of the way that they see the words to be used.
Well, very few definitions. There's a Definitions Act, isn't there?
Interpretations, I think they call it rather.
It's
than
interpretations.
Yeah, I've got it on my page here somewhere. But they
then
do
the
change.
interpretations are open to interpretation.
Well, that's exactly it. It speaks volumes just calling it the interpretations, doesn't it?
Yes. Why, for example, is Oxford English Dictionary not used globally everywhere? Because then everyone would have a fair chance of understanding what any given word means at any given time. But for example,
because there's a monopolies commission.
well,
I don't know.
oh, there's always one, isn't there? It's always you. Thank you so much for that. That really helps. But the definitions in legal dictionaries change too. If you look at previous versions and previous printings of words, they have changed.
I've got 9 editions of Black's, and if you look at the definitions of one word in number 1 and the same word in number 9, there's very little similarity to the definition at all.
So I think we can understand it does make sense that words are added to usage. Words are added to dictionaries all the time. I mean, the word chav, I would imagine, is in pretty much every dictionary. I doubt it's in a legal dictionary, but I imagine it's in now. It's common usage, but 15 years ago, possibly, it would never have been heard of. So, yes, we do add to our vocabulary, and we do also lose words that we don't use anymore.
And change the meaning of them.
Change the definitions. In a legal sense, is law not supposed to be a fixed entity? Are we not supposed to know how it works?
We have a system whereby common law has an effect, so obviously it's evolving to some extent all the time as people bring up different scenarios. For example, in a domestic violence situation where you're not to contact anyone directly or indirectly, if you're dealing with somebody young, they will be told that includes social media, Twitter, and they can string off a whole list depending on how savvy they are, which usually only goes as far as Twitter and Facebook, because that's what most people over about 30 are aware of, not all the others. But I mean, nobody would have been mentioning social media, nobody would have known what it was 15 years ago.
No, fair enough, but do they actually need to mention that? If they say that you are not to communicate with in any way, would that not just encompass it? Do they have to be specific? I think because therein lies loopholes, doesn't it? Like you say, there are things that can be left out if you start to make a list. It's never going to be complete.
In some scenarios, they're trying to be helpful to spell it out to somebody who perhaps doesn't realise that would be deemed to be communication. They're thinking, again, you come down to an interpretation of what something means.
That's right.
Communication to some people is just talking to them, whereas other people would assume that would be writing a letter. Now people expanding it to Facebooking them, Skyping them, using all sorts of other media, not just a simple picking up the telephone and ringing them up or sticking a letter through their door. So in some instances it's meant to be helpful, but of course interpretations can lead you astray if you do start to put in you shall not use this, this and this, because there's so many other
well, you didn't actually mention so-and-so, so I've done
so
that.
That's fine. And then
you didn't mention carrier pigeon, so...
So then somebody like me comes along and says, well, actually he's not in breach of that because you didn't include that in your list.
But then there's this... principle with judges to look at what the legislation meant. They will look at it first of all and say, what does this legislation say? Is it clear? Can we give it the common meaning? And then I'm sure you remember from learning law, it was the argument that if they say about apples and if they say about oranges and lemons and limes and other fruit, and if you come along and use a pear, then the judge will say, well, actually, we didn't mean that because we're talking about citrus fruit, because they have quoted oranges and lemons and limes. So there is this presupposition of what the legislation was supposed to mean. But yes, it leaves it a very grey area, doesn't it? And like you mentioned, common law.
I was reading this morning that the use of mobile phones, especially by motorists, and the risks to cyclists and other road users. And there was a case that was brought against Jimmy Carr, the comedian, who was using a mobile phone stopped by the police, and he said he was using it as a dictating machine in order to record a joke.
Right.
And so he paid Mr. whatever he is, Mr. Motoring lawyer to represent him, no doubt at vast expense, and got off because the use of the mobile phone was not one that the courts had in mind.
I think the truth was he got off because he paid a lot of money.
Well, there is that, and sadly that's the way the government's going.
Yes.
The more you can afford to pay, the more likely you'll be able to get off.
Yes. Well, this is very true with the fact that now how difficult it is to get legal aid. And
absolutely,
like you say, people like yourselves are closing shop or being forced to. Well, I have a thing here which is printed by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. It was published on the 16th of April last year. It's called When Laws Become Too Complex. It's not a particularly big document, and I'm only going to read you a little bit of it. But the author of this, and I say it's the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, so this is from the horse's mouth, so to speak. He says, I'm assuming it's a he, don't know why. This person says, legislation affects us all, and increasingly legislation is being searched for, read and used by a broad range of people. It's no longer confined to professional libraries. Websites like legislation.gov.uk have made it accessible to everyone. So the digital age has made it easier for people to find the law of the land, but once they've found it, they may be baffled. The law is regarded by its users, which I find an interesting word, as intricate and intimidating. That experience echoes observations that have been made about statute law for many years. The high volume of legislation, its piecemeal structure, its level of detail and frequent amendments, and the interaction with common law and European law mean that even professional users can find law complex, hard to understand, and difficult to comply with. It obstructs good government. It undermines the rule of law. He says, I believe that we need to establish a sense of shared accountability within and beyond government for the quality of what, perhaps misleadingly, we call our statute book, and to promote a shared professional pride in it. In doing so, we hope to create confidence amongst users that legislation is for them. Now, my argument would be, and this will be up after the news, I would argue that it demonstrates that legislation is meant to be a consensual matter, because he says, I hope we can create confidence amongst users that legislation is for them.
Broadcasting online.
www.riviera.fm.
Torp Bay's community radio station. This is Riviera FM.
Well, that was chosen by our resident lawyer here, Anne Blue, she's a funky chick. She knows all the up-to-date stuff, you can tell. And that was All Rise. Just before the break there, we were just talking about this, the Office of Parliamentary Counsel saying that I hope we can create confidence amongst users that legislation is for them. And the question is, let me ask our criminal lawyer specialist here. And who owns me?
Well, nobody owns you, I would hope. But you're horribly regulated by masked bodies that have been created by people in power.
Yeah, masked or masked?
Both, probably.
Yes, I think so. What was your expression the other day about?
Yes, yeah. Consent is the mask behind which evil hides.
I rather like that. I've got a Viva Vendetta feel about it, hasn't it? Yeah.
It just came to me one
day.
day.
Well, masked and masked. So effectively, there is this theoretical idea of the social contract. People say you can't just dip out of laws. You can't dip out of law. And I agree. You can't dip out of law. You can't go about hurting someone. You can't go about stealing from someone. You know the things where there is a genuine victim.
Crime.
Causing harm.
Exactly. But they say crime is failing to fill in a form for the police. That's a criminal matter. How it not doing something
taking your
can be
children
criminal.
on holiday during the school term.
How can it possibly be criminal? But they've codified it as crime. But I say they. It's horrible having to say this them and us, but it seems to be more them and us.
Maybe we should say big society.
Yeah, psychopaths
with the help
in
of
Westminster,
our corporate parents
perhaps we could say. Yeah, but so if nobody owns me, and I think it's accepted that nobody could own me because that would be slavery.
Yes.
If nobody owns me, who? Let's have some real names here, because it can only be individuals. There is no such thing as a corporation, because it's still people who run it. If they didn't exist, the corporation wouldn't exist. So if nobody owns me, who has a higher authority over me than me? How does that come about?
By consent.
And on that stony silence.
Yes, by consent, isn't it? They assume that consent using the machinations that they have put in place, and that assumed consent is what they're using all the time to so-called keep us in
But
place.
it can't be assumed consent, because when we make it clear and we express that we don't consent, it happens anyway.
Yes, but that doesn't. You can say what you like to somebody who has been common purpose to the degree that they're not actually listening to what is coming out of your mouth.
Does not compute.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose if you start off as a child, your parents don't own you, but they, to some extent, control you. Once, in this country, you turn 18, you're only controlled by the situation in which you find yourself on a day-to-day basis and how that is applied to you. And so, depending on your religious views, I suppose there is some form of religious control.
So it's actually it's being in the country.
It's being in the world, isn't it? The world has control over most people. There is a hierarchy. Even if you take a tribe in the Amazon jungle, they need to work together and have some sort of structure. And if they don't have structure, so you're talking of structure being represented by some form of rules. I mean, I happen to think...
But those rules are about, again, harming someone or taking something from them. They're not about something ridiculously abstract, as many of these legislations are.
I mean, they...
and they're not about commerce.
No, I have a QC of my acquaintance who said there should be a ministry for unintended consequences.
Yes, Ministry for Common Sense could be next door, I think. But
well, I wondered whether we should start a common sense party, because a lot of what I imagine people see in Nigel Farage is just them speaking with a pint and a cigarette
Yes.
He doesn't look like all the rest. It may be that
Exactly.
you don't disagree with him, but at least he looks...
Perhaps he's picking up what used to be the old Labour voters who wanted someone who actually sounded like he talked in their language.
Yes, I imagine.
Oh, God help them then. Poor
Well,
if that's their language, then there is medication out there. Do seek help. Other parties are available.
Common Sense Party. I do like that, though. Common Sense Party.
Yes, a Common Sense Party wouldn't stand to go in this ridiculous...
Well, nobody would vote for it, would
Circus
they?
in the first place,
Because it
would
would be commonsensical
not to.
not to.
So it appears to me there's this thing that we hear about in courts, we hear about on mainstream media, we hear politicians talk about it, and they talk about this social contract. There is a social contract, which I think you were just alluding to there, that says we all do as we are told because it's socially acceptable to do so, and we would be ostracised not. And I think an example would be perhaps the Amish work that way, don't they?
They do
have
indeed,
they're
yeah.
very strict and based on religious rules, and it's called dogma and doctrine. It's not called dogma and doctrine for nothing. Doctrine means indoctrinate. It means brainwash. We're brainwashing people to do and behave the way our little social group expects us to. So that if there's this social contract, how does this come about, Max?
Well, what you've given me here is it's quite interesting. I'm just reading through it. In moral and political philosophy, the social contract or political contract is a theory or model originating during the Age of Enlightenment, which began, I'm told here, in the late 17th century Europe.
That was my little bit of research there.
Okay. That typically addresses the questions of the origin of society and the legitimacy of the authority of the state over the individual. Social contract arguments typically posit that individuals have consented, either explicitly or tacitly, to surrender some of their freedoms and submit to the authority of the ruler or magistrate, or to the decision of a majority, in exchange for protection of their remaining rights. The question of the relation between natural and legal rights, therefore, is often an aspect of social contract theory.
Yeah, theory. Theory.
Yeah.
So it's a theory. But in practice, it's not theoretical. In practice, people are getting beaten up, thrown in court, and having to pay ridiculous amounts of money, usually, to get out one way or another.
But it requires your sign of nature.
Oh, well, that's
Or as in Robert Greene's case, not getting out. 100 days in custody
Yes.
without a charge.
Yes, without access to legal
Without
advice.
access to anything, really.
Yes.
And without even being informed why he was there.
and you have the naked rambler who was constantly being arrested because he chose not to wear clothes, which
Yes.
seems
Yes.
totally bizarre to me.
Doesn't it?
But then other people say, well, I don't want to see a naked man wandering around the street. It shocks my children.
Yes. It shocks your children because you've told your children you're shocked. They wouldn't be
Possibly.
shocked
This
because
is-
children walk about naked, don't they?
This is the idea of offence, to give offence.
You can't give offence, you can only take offence.
That's it. It seems crazy that, you can have a nice party going on and there's nobody's offended except one person who possibly hasn't been invited who can shut the whole thing down. It's just extraordinary to me.
Yeah, it is odd, and as I say, as you've read there, it's a philosophy, it's a theory.
Yeah.
So, when we talk about law then, would it be fair that when we mean the type of law that's forced upon us individually, that we should really be using the term legislation and leave the term law for those crimes with victims? Because it would appear that victimless matters, although they're often referred to as crimes, are in reality offences or breach of some implied, intangible, invisible civil contract. Legislation must be civil. It must be. How can it not be a civil matter, really? It's one person saying you must or must not do something and then you've broken the law. Again, government exists to punish people for not following the rules that they hadn't agreed to follow in the first place.
Yes, and you've got so many laws and so many rules. Coming back to what the council said that you read out earlier, there's so much now that people don't really see it for them. It's a bit like, I suppose, having a bunch of flowers, which is nice, as opposed to an enormous forest of flowers which are overwhelming and overpowering. Small amounts that you can see the point of
Yeah.
are beneficial to you. I imagine, coming back to before the Age of Enlightenment, I was reading once about how the sort of nation states of Europe built up, and effectively it was might is right, and you
force.
followed somebody because they protected you, so you agreed to go along with what they were suggesting, so you didn't get beaten up.
Well, as it ever is now, isn't it? We know we're
still
America light, aren't we? We do what the big guys say because you don't want to be on the wrong side of America, do you? Really?
You keep saying it's force, but
You use a different term, don't you?
well, it's violence, really. It's force. Force is what you can use against violence.
Right.
Right? If somebody comes at you violently, then you can use force to stop them.
Mm.
That's the way I see it. If you actually go out to get someone, you're being violent. You're not using force. You're being violent. And you can use the force. The person who's being attacked can use force to protect themselves.
Somebody's using force for good is somebody else is being violent.
Yes. Well, this is where the police fall back on this reasonable force. We used reasonable force because we had reasonable suspicion.
What they're going to tell you is that they're about to hit you.
Yes.
They're going to hurt you.
If you don't comply, and
because they're telling you they're going to use reasonable force, you are going to consent to that, all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the way.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to have to leave out quite a lot of things that we were going to go through today because time is just racing on. We're just having too much fun here. As a lawyer, Anne, you uphold all legislation and you work within it, don't you? You're sort of strictly ruled that you work within the legislative guidelines.
Well, it's my job. Well, not. In some cases, it's to find the problems within the issues. I had a case not long ago, an allegation of public order. What you could see on the CCTV was what the police interpreted as an assault. The person being assaulted chose not to make a complaint, so they charged public order, and what they couldn't get past was the fact that without any sound, nobody could be said to be being upset by what they were seeing, and the person who was on the receiving end, without making a complaint, might have consented to what was going on for whatever reason. And they got very cross with me because I pointed out that you actually need all the evidence. You can't just do it because you've got a film of it.
Full disclosure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
well,
you
thank
must
goodness
do the
there are
job
people
properly.
like yourself out there because there are
That's what
plenty of people who don't actually care.
being a bit well, it's good to be political,
Human.
and human. I mean, that's why they are trying to get rid of the average criminal defence lawyer. That's what we do. We're, in many ways, we're checks and balances.
Yeah.
We're there saying, well, you haven't got the evidence for that. You're going to have to look again.
Well, this is just something I was just going to come to here, actually. I'll jump ahead on that because you've said this here. Now, we have the Treason Felony Act here, 1848. It's an act of Parliament. It's a law which protects the Queen and the Crown. Nothing else. It protects her and her family and her financial interests. I think is a précis of that.
The firm.
The offences of the Act were originally high treason under the Sedition Act 1661, and then that became later the Treason Act 1795, and consequently at the time the penalty was death. So
Still is, I think.
I think it's just you can be sent off to the colonies now or fined something silly like £25. I don't think it's particularly, but it still exists.
I was under the impression, and I'm sure somebody who knows more will correct me, that things like piracy on the high seas and treason still in theory carried the death penalty.
Yeah.
Arson in Her Majesty's Dockyard, I think, was one of the last ones to be struck from there.
Yeah,
Yes.
but this is where I was going. It's treason felony too, and I quote, compass, imagine, invent, devise or intend to deprive Elizabeth Windsor of her crown, to levy war against her, or to move or stir any foreigner to invade the United Kingdom or any country belonging to her. How a country can belong to a woman without being force and violence, I fail to understand. But anyway, there are three reasons I just mentioned. There are three reasons I just mentioned the Treason Felony Act. The first one is it demonstrates that juries can nullify legislation. They have done before. So legislation exists, and then juries can come along hearing a trial and say, no, actually, we don't think this should apply to you. This is a nonsense. And they can say, not guilty, we're not finding you guilty. Even though they have technically done everything that they have been accused of, the jury can come along later and say, no.
I've seen it happen. Well, I've heard of it happen a while back
Wonderful.
involving a fox hunting case where the judge, who's no longer with us, gave a very clear direction to the jury that they should convict somebody for offences in relation to
It's highly illegal.
and the jury came back and they effectively
Oh,
said
good.
no, not guilty.
Judges should not be directing juries, should they?
They shouldn't be.
They should not be.
And bless the jury system. They
Yes.
didn't like being told what to do, so they didn't do it.
Would that not have been a perfect appeal there under a void order if the judge had instructed the jury and they had found him guilty anyway?
Yes.
People don't use their power very often, do they? People lay down and take them
and
so
I think
often.
I remember a case I come from Kent, and I remember a case where a father attacked, I think it was a lorry driver who'd killed his daughter, just mown her down and hadn't really been punished, and attacked him, and the jury there acquitted him of murder because they were seeing the case through his eyes as opposed to the pure law of the situation, which says you shall not kill. They said, but if it was us, we would probably do the same.
And the law
for my sins, I've perused, perused is perhaps overputting it. I've had a look through Halsbury's commentaries on the law, and there's this wonderful sentence, I wish I could remember exactly which volume and what page it was on, which says, "The only lawful court in this land is a jury of your peers."
Yeah.
The only lawful court in this land is a jury of your peers. That means that a jury...
It makes the law. Well, that's what makes common law, isn't
makes
it?
a law.
It does make
Well,
common law.
it's not common law. That's
law.
That's
just law in big letters.
Big letters. That to me is law.
In some way, that's true democracy.
It is correct. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So your community decides
your peers,
how we're going to live.
Yeah. They say whether they think that's a sensible course of action or not.
Absolutely. Well, the second reason I mentioned the Treason and Felony Act is that the third clause in this, to move or stir any foreigner to invade the United Kingdom or any other country belonging to Elizabeth Windsor, surely that was breached by Edward Heath in the 70s when he gave away the UK sovereignty to Europe. Surely that was treason, in accordance with the Treason and Felony Act, was it not?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because how much have you given it away?
Well, they've given away our laws and rights, so what else have they got? They
haven't got the actual physical land. So again, you're
Not
into
yet.
the realms of into the realms of definitions, aren't you? In many ways, what is her land?
So
how can it be her land anyway?
Are we protecting definitions here, or are we protecting something that belongs to us?
Yes, certainly not us. Well, the third reason I brung up, I've been dragged up, all for me. The third reason I said it brings up the question of the UK government's ardent wish now to leave the EU, and in particular to get rid of the Human Rights Act. They're always pressing for this lately, which protects us, at the moment, it protects us from the Treason and Felony Act. Because we're here saying, we don't... Hello, Elizabeth Windsor. I do not consent to be governed or told what to do by you, love. Take your tiara and do one. I'm quite happy to say that, and I've allegedly just committed treason. And fine, bring it on. But at the moment, the Human Rights Act would protect me, allegedly, from that. So when that goes, at the moment that's a higher law than the UK's own domestic legislation, and our legislation has to become in alignment with the UK laws. Presumably that will come back into effect again, the Treason and Felony Act.
For that law to be superior to our own, then treason must have been committed because power has been handed to a foreign agency.
Ooh, I like the way you think. That is a good argument.
It's a logical
there, isn't
conclusion.
It? Oh, we like that. Oh, thank you very much, mister. Well, I'm going to play a little bit of music, and after that I'm going to come back with my next guest. This is for the sweet-talking woman in the studio.
Riviera FM, bringing social game to Torbay.
Hello, it's a lovely sunny Torbay too. We're roasting in here. You're listening to the Lioness on Riviera FM. Today we're talking about consent and asking who consents for me if I don't. And I have Nick and Max in the studio, and I'm delighted to say Anne Bell Chambers, who's a criminal law specialist and founder partner of Bay Advocates, hasn't run away. She's still here, bless her. Sweet talking woman there, she is. That was a yellow, in case you didn't guess. Now, a prominent anti-globalist activist last May claimed his career was in ruins after he was cleared of raping a woman at the protest camp outside St Paul's Cathedral. He was accused of raping a fellow protester at the protest camp, as I say, outside St Paul's Cathedral, on 2 separate occasions, a week apart. The jury returned from a formal not guilty verdicts at the Old Bailey following the high-profile 8-day trial. He was alleged to have raped the fellow protester, with whom he was in a casual sexual relationship, inside her tent as they took part in the Occupy London protest in January 2012. On one occasion, the jury's been told he attacked her while she had passed out drunk. On another occasion, he was accused of using a ligature to throttle the woman whilst he forced her to perform a sex act upon him. He was acquitted after compelling evidence that the allegations were malicious and fabricated, and they were presented at his trial. That evidence, including social media comments and messages between the two which established a timeline of the actual events, completely contradicted the woman's claims. Speaking outside the court, he said, 12 months of my life have been on hold. I've not eaten, I've not slept. Now, the Daily Mail can be quoted as saying, Blackman, this is my guest, Blackman, Mr. Blackman, apparently acted as the leader and spokesman for Anonymous UK, who they say is the British wing of the global internet hacking group that carries out cyber attacks on capitalist targets and governments. My guest is keen to highlight the Daily Mail's coverage of this case and the City of London Police for what he describes as their vigorous pursuit of a completely without substance case. And he told me last week when I was planning this show, the biggest factor regarding consent for me is how can anyone consent to be policed by the police services of the UK when they're clearly policing on two different levels with a law for the poor and seemingly a different law for the rich. So, on that note, please welcome my second guest here today, Mr. Malcolm Blackman.
Thank you, Lioness. It's lovely to be on the show.
Hello, how are you? How are you doing?
Very well. It's a bit wet and windy up here at Fastlane, but it's very, very well I'm doing.
Wonderful. Now, the Daily Mail and the City of London Police identified you as being part of Anonymous and the Occupy movement. Now, do you think that played any part in what happened to you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's as plain as the nose on your face that they vigorously pursued, completely without substance allegations, simply because I was not a leading light at Occupy, but I was very much on the front line of Occupy. And, as part of the Anonymous UK ground movement, we drew a lot of attention, a lot of press. And during my time there, I did a lot of research into the City of London and, the sort of secret dealings and the completely, sometimes illegal actions that they take. So I believe that once I started naming sponsors of St Paul's and how the City of London has very much dominated and controlled St Paul's and is completely in charge of St Paul's, I think, I became a target and they did really, really come after me.
Right. You said they acted illegally. In what way would you? What would you mean by that?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, you say that the police often acted illegally. What do you mean by that?
Not the police. The Corporation City of London. I mean, as we all know, any corporation must produce on request its ledgers and its accounts, its books. The Corporation City of London is a state of its own and will not reveal its books at all. Every corporation, we as the public have a right to inspect their books, inspect their ledgers, and yet the City of London, you can't get near it. That I am under the impression is unlawful.
Do they call themselves a corporation, or is that what you're saying?
Well, the City of London Corporation is very much like the state of Washington, D.C. The City of London, as you know, is a sovereign state of its own and has its own private police force.
That's what I mean. Do they say they're a corporation in accordance with the normal UK corporation rules, or have they not got their own rules, therefore they're not obliged to comply with yours?
They don't seem to be obliged to comply with anything. If you look closely, their attitude is very blasé, and they are to all intents and purposes above the law. They have their own police force, which are privately funded and have allegiances only to the Corporation City of London. They're not there to police the public, and they're certainly not policing us by consent.
So effectively, you're trespassing if they say you are in the City of London.
That's correct. Yes, you can be removed from the City of London. It's even becoming apparent now when if you follow people like Danny Shine, who tries to highlight the fact that we are losing more and more of our own land. I believe he's been caught or been moved on several times just recently for using a megaphone outside of railway stations and such likes in the City of London.
Could that not just be simply a breach of the peace?
Not really, because we're looking at freedom of expression and freedom of speech. Plus, as you know, they're trying to bring in new Prevention of Nuisance and Annoyance Acts, which means that buskers will not be allowed to play. They're really bringing down the hammer on freedom in the City of London and the surrounds. I mean, it's starting to happen all across the country now. I'm a firm believer that we are marching headlong, blindly into a police state.
Yeah, you're not alone in that. I was going to actually, my question is here actually, what is consent in the UK? I was going to ask you what you think, and I was going to say, does it exist at all, or is it a mask the state wears to hide a police state or oligarchy that has been regularly claimed of late and is claimed more often?
This is it. You see, as you're probably aware, I sent a rather scathing email to Theresa May, saying, how can I consent to be policed by these police forces when I see blatant two-tier policing, a law for the rich, the elite, the politicians and royalty, and a law for the poor? And not only that, to give a good example, is, I've seen police assisting bailiffs removing families from homes in the pouring rain. Do I consent to that? Because the corporations or the banks have seized property back after it's the banks themselves who have created the problem. I mean, the whole Occupy movement was to highlight the banking fraud and the banking industry, but on the tail of that has come all the other exposure for all the other criminality that is now starting to occur.
Yes.
As far as my attitude is concerned, as you know, I've signed up and registered with Lioness Law, and I'm pleased to say I haven't had any interaction with police since I've done that. But
You will.
For one, yeah, I'm sure I will. But I, for one, am a firm believer that it's my consent and it's up to me whether I give it. And I after seeing, the brutality at Barton Moss, after watching even now the brutality or the absolute disregard for lawful, peaceful protest, a human right, being rolled out, and the criminalisation of people protesting lawfully. This is, it's becoming just a little bit too much like the fact that we as the United Kingdom declare openly that we are a democracy and freedom of speech. This is the land of the free, almost as America. But whereas if you look very, very carefully, we consulted about nothing with regard to changes in policy or changes in things that are going on. One of my pet hates is the water cannon, the German heavy armour that's coming over to anti-personnel armour.
And the rubber bullets. Don't forget the rubber bullets there.
And the tear gas. I mean, Boris Johnson and Theresa May, between them, have managed to do everything that Hitler failed to do. He wanted to put German heavy armour on our mainland and rule by dictatorship. But they're bringing in German Wasserwaffen 9000 water cannons. And they say it's for riot control, where it's actually been proven that they would be inadequate and ineffective in any kind of riot situation. They will be used on lawful, peaceful protest, and the system will be that the lawful large gatherings, maybe 10,000 or so, will be agitated, will be kettled, will be provoked. If people don't follow the lead of Occupy London, in which there was absolutely no resistance or no retaliation to the police's heavy-handed first night, you'll find that the police will be continuing to up their robust policing. I've heard Theresa May say on many occasions, and Bernard Hogg-Hogan, the Met Police Commissioner, both say that we are policed by consent in this country. Well, I want proof of that. And to do that, you must withdraw your consent, which I've done. I cannot stand by and consent and remain silenced while homeless populations have their possessions and blankets snatched on the streets of Croydon by the UK Police Service. If you look recently on the social media, you've now got studs and spikes sticking up under flyovers and out in doorways to stop homeless people sheltering from the elements. It's madness. I can't consent to this, and I won't consent to this.
So you dissent on ethical grounds?
On ethical grounds, yeah. I mean, I would gladly consent to be policed. Some years back, in fact, just as Occupy was on, I believe you'll find a video on YouTube somewhere where I'm praising the British police force for their professionalism, their courage under fire. They've been shot at a few times, their dedication to duty. They were one of the most admired police forces in the world. Now, I retract that statement wholeheartedly, 100%. They are thugs. They have employed psychopaths, as far as I'm concerned. I've seen brutality at a level that should be assigned to a dictatorial regime in the Far East. It's abysmal behaviour, and I think it's about time the public united and said no. However, having said that, I am wondering if it is a plan by the government to demonise the police. As you know, the police are facing. The Police Federation faced a scathing attack from Theresa May the other day, and everyone cheered. But I, as far as I'm concerned, I want to see the British Bobby back on the beat. I want to see Dixon of Doc Green style. And in fact, if I really wanted to push it, I would make them salute again, to salute the public, because they are public servants, and I've.
Are they?
Well,
do you have proof of this? This is quite often a statement that they say about local council, they say about government, they say police. They say they are public servants and they should be protecting and serving the public. Where does it actually say that? I think that's a common misconception.
Do you?
Yes, I do. I don't like saying it, but I think it is.
I'm under the impression it rolls back to common law, where if you are employed by a government, or for a public duty, then you are officially a public servant. You are there to serve the public, not to oppress them, not to dictate to them, and not to badger, harass, and fit them up, which is another one that's really beginning to annoy me, because I'm now seeing an awful lot more of the manipulation of the law. For instance, you know, if you saw the Teagate scandal at Barton Moss with Dr. Stephen Pears, it was a blatant effort to remove a videographer from who's acting lawfully. We have a lawful right in this country to film in public spaces, and if a police officer happens to be in that public space performing his duty, we have a lawful right to film that. So, you know, I have evidence on my YouTube channel of a police officer shoving Dr. Stephen Pears away, saying, away with that. So what does he mean by with that? He means with that video camera. Get away from me with that video camera while I'm breaking the law. Because he's clearly, the officers can clearly be seen using overzealous and unjustifiable and unreasonable force on a protector who's up against the fence saying, I'm not resisting, and he's clearly not resisting.
Yeah, I'd just like to remind my guests here in the studio, please feel free to join in this conversation, because it's very interesting. It is, it certainly.
They really don't like to say it, but they're not using force. What they're using is violence. And hello, Malcolm.
Yes, they are. Hello.
That's Nick, by the way.
Hi, Nick.
Yeah, and it's just interesting the way that you say that you don't consent to these behaviours. And now I think it was last week, it was very recently, I've just read it, some newspaper was talking about that the police are now saying that they're not going to go out and police on the streets unless they can get back and collaborate on their stories afterwards within a certain amount of time. This is armed police, isn't it?
Oh, this is the armed police story, yes, I read that.
I find that extremely disturbing, that they refuse to do their job unless they can go back and collaborate.
Some might call that conspiracy.
Exactly. This is exactly the point. You know, the whole point of taking statements from any individual or interviewing any individual is to take that statement while it's fresh, not 48 hours later, and before they've had a chance to communicate those facts to anyone else.
What's your view of that, Anne, if we just ask our resident solicitor here? What's your view of that?
Well, I'm thinking of Hillsborough, where, of course, the collusion was what led to the Liverpool fans being blamed for the death of the many people that were killed, because they all clubbed together afterwards and decided what time things happened and who did what.
Exactly.
My other concern, echoing what you're saying, and I only know of Devon and Cornwall, is that most of the reception areas of police stations are being shut down, so the public isn't going to be able to just wander into a police station and talk to the police authority,
Yes.
albeit about sort of simple things, but it keeps the interaction going. And if you start to distance the police force from the public, then there's all sorts of problems that can follow from that.
I think that's true of an argument too with government officials to a large degree. If you are connected with the people around you, you are not going to enforce corrupted legislation. You are not going to force violence on people that you know, that you're going to pass in the street, that you say hello to, your mum has tea with. If you've got face-to-face interaction with people you know, you are likely to uphold their views and their rights and represent them the way they want to be represented.
It would be helpful to all.
Yeah, but once you go up there and you're just this anonymous paid millionaire who has no idea about what the people want, you don't represent them, you're just there because you're on a great gravy train for life.
As a constable,
It allows you, doesn't it? It allows that little switch to somebody's brain to say, I can do this to faceless no, because I don't actually have a connection with them. It's this sort of psychopathic mentality that allows you.
When I introduced myself, I said I was a person first and very much a lawyer second.
Yes.
And you need police officers to remember that they're people first.
And they are sworn to
and
uphold
police
that.
officers second. And one of the things that you always see, there is a right to have a solicitor every time you're in the police station. Many people don't take up that right. Police officers, if they find themselves being investigated, always have a solicitor.
Oh, they do. They're not stupid.
And that tells you everything you need to know.
Is it a man who represents himself as a fool for a client? Is that what they say? Although I hate to do that. I'm going to have to disagree with you.
Feel free.
Because there are a number of people I know, this is sort of off subject slightly, who have been found guilty in magistrates' court with a solicitor present, who myself personally, God help me, has gone and assisted with them in their appeal, and we have won every single appeal. A first-year law student. So my argument is, why were they found guilty when they had a qualified, well-paid lawyer? Why were they found guilty if someone like me can go on and say, well, actually, no, that's a nonsense, and prove it in 3 minutes?
I was thinking more in the police station that if you've got something that's being offered to you for nothing, i.e. a lawyer to come in, then you really ought to think very carefully about whether or not you have a lawyer with you. We're not all perfect, and we're not all at the same level. There's good lawyers and there's not so good lawyers.
But something very simple. Something very simple as Rice versus Connolly. I mean, how many lawyers don't know that?
That would be consenting, though, wouldn't it? That would be consenting.
To what?
To being governed,
being represented.
Yeah.
Represented.
Yeah. Having a lawyer in the...
Yeah, that would be consenting to the whole system being correct, and you just do with me what you like. Sort of.
And find me guilty.
Well, I think, if you don't mind me jumping in, I think the biggest problem we have with consent is the glaring difference between the two-tier policing level. Since 2005, when the EU brought in an act or a law stating that all EU MPs or all Euro MPs are immune from questioning. Immune like it's a disease. You know, they're immune from questioning on any crimes except hate crimes and driving offences.
Yeah,
and both of those must be current. They cannot be historical. This is why I'm so angry, because as Joe Public, I was accused of a crime. I was accused of 2 serious sexual offences crimes. I presented a mountain of evidence to the police that contradicted the statement of the lady in question, and yet I was still put through the trial process.
And that was trial by media, wasn't it? Because
it was trial by media. Yes, you know, the Daily Fail were very vigorous in their front page news. In fact, it caused me to take almost a year to recover. You know, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. It took me a year to recover my composure and actually get back out there. But the problem we face is the fact that people are unaware that there's a 2-tier police system. They are unaware that Joe Public can be accused of something with no substance whatsoever, be charged with that, because the police give the mantra, oh, it's down to the CPS to decide whether they charge. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the CPS need two things to charge. One is it has to be in the public's interest, and two is there must be evidence. If there is no evidence, you should not be. But as far as I was concerned, my case when I was in, I didn't think I needed a lawyer. I was like, oh, this is no further action. I'll just show them the truth, and they'll. But no, because I'm an activist, I was then thrown straight into the Old Bailey for, my first ever real offence, apart from strumping apples at 16. I'm in the Old Bailey in court number 3. And I have to prove my innocence. And my solicitor at the time did say, innocent till proven guilty is supposed to be the mantra, but in cases like these, you need to be able to prove your innocence, which I did.
Which is understandable, which is, I think, in cases like that, it's fair. Because it's very difficult for a victim of rape to prove.
Well, I agree, and I said after my trial that I believe that there should be anonymity for both parties until the verdict is returned. Because my life, obviously I have my family to consider, I had my friends, and it's surprising how many of my activist friends who claim to be awake to the New World Order swallowed the media spin and the city's take on it. Reading the front page of the Daily Mail, they'd already made up their minds. But yet, when it came to my defence 3 or 4 days into the trial, there was no one in the public gallery. Nobody got to hear the truth, because they'd all just stayed for the first 3 days, the explosive sensationalism, and they go, oh, well, he must be guilty, and when? So when my defence was delivered, there was only a handful of people in the court that heard the truth, and luckily enough, 12 of those were jurors. And the good thing about that is 12 people that don't know me, that had no bias whatsoever, made up their minds and said, return not guilty verdicts. Yeah. It was an obvious thing to do. But if that can be done to me, then surely we can take a politician. I've been reading on the internet recently, it's all over the internet, about Leon Britton. I've been following Bill Maloney's claims with his survivor, his child abuse survivor, Andrew, who claims that he was shackled to a bed and forced to film, the murder of a child by Sidney Cook, who, as we know, is in cahoots. But we have this systematic, institutionalised paedophilia in our parliament, and the police cannot even question these people. So
we're going to discuss that next week.
How can this not be a two-tier police system? How can I consent to this? Unless the law is fair and just and for everybody, then I want out. I do not have any faith in the police force anymore, simply because of just watching their investigations get closed down and slowly pushed away. They give us tidbits on the television about celebrities in the hope that we will stop asking questions about this list of politicians and the royal establishment. Well, I'm not going to shut up, because what is now is I am living proof of a two-tier police system, a policing system and a trial system for the poor, and a policing system for the rich.
Actual knowledge is really hard to get rid of, isn't it? If you have actual knowledge of something, it's very hard to express it to someone else as well, if they haven't experienced it.
Yes, it is. As far as I'm concerned, what I went through, Leon Britton should go through. If there should be no difference between me and him. But look at me, I'm an activist, and they did their level best to put me away for this. They had no cause to follow it, and really it was just to discredit me, to smear my name, and to smear the name of Occupy London and Anonymous UK. It was to demonise and discredit, and it's manipulated so that the police can say, oh, it's down to the CPS, and then my barrister said, and the police said, oh, well, we do this because it has to be put in front. Cases like these have to be put in front of a jury to decide, so we can be seen to be looking sympathetic to the victim. Well, why is that not the case with the politicians? Why is that not the case? Because as far as I'm concerned, if I can be put through, and it is a harrowing ordeal, it really is a harrowing ordeal. If I could be put through that as a member of the public, Joe Public, then I expect all the people we vote into offices in civic offices and as public to be able to go through the same system. And the police manipulate it, or the government especially, interference with the laws. A lot of honest coppers out there I've spoken to, they know what's going on, but their hands are tied. They've changed the laws, so the police have no lawful requirement or no lawful duty and no powers to actually question these people. So if you can't question them, you can't investigate them. If you can't investigate them, you can't come to a conclusion. If you can't come to a conclusion, you can't prosecute them. And this is how it works. You see people like Caroline Lucas being arrested at protests and being charged in magistrates' courts. It's not. It's unacceptable for heinous crimes through allegations not to be investigated simply because someone is an MP or they are royalty. Because let's face it, Bill Maloney's right. This goes an awful long way up. There is a lot of documentation from the Haute de Guerre.
Well, I'm going to stop you there, because we will be discussing that next week, actually, on the next show, which I'll introduce in a minute. I want to thank you so much. We're running out of time, unfortunately. Today has just flown by. It's just been astounding. Thank you very much. That was Malcolm Blackman. I'm going to play a little music now, and then we're going to have to wind it up, I'm afraid. Thank you, Malcolm.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me on.
You take care now. Bye.
Bye-bye now.
That was the KLF featuring Tammy Wynette, Justified and Ancient. We're hoping that perhaps applies to our legal system. Well, what a debate that was. Thank you. It's astounding stuff and such fun. And sadly, that's all we've got time to work for this week. I'd like to thank my wonderful guests, Nick and Mac again. Mac? Again? I did that once before, didn't I? Yeah. Got someone else's teeth in. Nick and Mac's in the studio. And Anne Bell Chambers from Bay Advocates, who's been an absolute star, and I do hope that I haven't frightened you off, and perhaps you'll come back again one day.
No, I don't feel too mauled by the Lioness.
Well, yes, I'm lulling you into a false sense of
maybe
security. And Malcolm Blackman on the phone, obviously, who we've just spoken to. We've been talking about consent. And I also have to say to my faithful fuzzy little friend here, Pixie, who's wandering around, who's always with us on the shows and is no trouble at all. She does all this research, you know. You may not realise.
That's why it's so dogmatic.
That makes sense.
Next week's subject will be a rather controversial one, and it comes with a warning that this may trigger. If you have issues here, this may trigger you, and I am warning because I do know what happens. It's entitled The Paedophile Connection, and we'll be asking why all the cover-ups. And again, I must warn you, this may trigger. Now, if you'd like to take part in the show by phone or in person, you can email the studio on studio@riviera.fm or message me on my Facebook page, The Lioness Raw, that's RAW, or on the Riviera FM Facebook page. Next up now, we've got the 5 o'clock news, followed by Eddie Falcon and his 50s Hot Wax Show. I've been the Lioness. You've been wonderful. I'll be back next Monday at 3 o'clock, and I hope you've enjoyed today's show. I love you. In Lakesh.